Welcome back to part 2, Series C. Now, the theme for this series was people who contributed to the formation of modern Ireland, but avoiding anyone too controversial for being associated with faction or sectarianism. Did they not realise what country they were doing? What do you think? Anyway, 5. Catherine Macaulay. Early 19th century religious sister, which are different from nuns because they don't live in a cloister and are more focused on outreach and social services. And you are very heavy and standing on my leg. After coming into her inheritance in 1822, she set out to form a house for her and other Catholic lay women where they would house and educate. Come on, stand still. Yeah, shut up. After coming into her inheritance in 1822, she set out to form a house for her and other Catholic lay women where they could house and educate destitute women and orphans. This opened in 1827 and eventually turned into the Sisters of Mercy in 1831. It being advised that they should take vows because the clergy and local people were worried that they were taking on a long-term commitment and might otherwise lose interest or get married. The Sisters of Mercy now have about 6,200 members worldwide. Now, putting her on a banknote wasn't controversial in 1991, however, like a lot of Catholic institutions, a lot of, in some cases very literal, dirty laundry has come out. In 2006, they themselves released a report where they admitted that maybe it had not been a great environment to raise children because attending services at all hours of the day and night was overly rigorous, and valuing silence and equality is not really consistent with good communication or physical affection. Can I help you? The Ryan report of 2009 stated, and I'm just going to leave that hanging there. They have regretted, but refused to compensate, the women who were imprisoned in the laundries they ran on the grounds that they were not compensated for housing them and they were not one for profit. This was a widespread thing in Ireland for a long time, originally for fallen women to take them off the streets and put them to work. Then any female criminal, single mothers, delinquent girls, women who defied conservative Catholic mores, or in some cases sent there by their families because they were too pretty and might become prostitutes. Prostitution does not work that way! Oh yes, who are you going to trust, me or a bunch of celibate people? Zero out of 1 for dodging controversy here. £10. James Joyce, writer. Best known for Ulysses, a 730-page modernist knowledge of such importance, depth and complexity that to this day entire Irish studies departments keep themselves their version of busy trying to find new things to say about it. I don't think the same is true of Ulysses 31. Should also point out that he lived most of his life in Europe, leaving Ireland in 1902 and kept a British passport rather than an Irish one, even when it would have been more advantageous to switch, like when you're in Vichy France in 1940. No Irish diplomat attended his funeral in Zurich, although a British one did, and the Irish government showed no interest in repatriating his remains until 2019. Well, we're 1 out of 2 for dodging controversy. I won't deduct points for not living in Ireland or taking an Irish passport, because there is very little more Irish than leaving Ireland. On the back, one of the riverheads from the customs house. Alright, is this actually a beloved monument, or is this just inertia at this point? Check TripAdvisor. Okay. The Customs House is the 88th most popular attraction in Dublin. 84th is the National Print Museum. 67th is go-karting. And 61st is the National Leprechaun Museum. You know, I wasn't going to do any stupid stereotype for this, but if you're going to have a National Leprechaun Museum and you deserve what you get, you do. Fucking idiots. Going to go with inertia. 20, The Liberator. No. Daniel O'Connell. Oh boy. To sum up several hundred years of history very quickly, the Irish Catholics were on the losing side of a lot of wars and ended up a disenfranchised and oppressed majority in their own country. To put it in Babylon 5 terms, the British are the century and the Irish are the Nams. Now, you could have said this. For example, you couldn't own land without jumping through hoops, you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold public office, you couldn't own firearms, you couldn't own a horse worth more than £5. Now, some of these so-called penal laws were gradually rolled back towards the end of the 18th century. O'Connell benefited from this because he was able to become a lawyer, which previously would have been prohibited. He turned out to be extremely good at this. He also began pressing for full Catholic emancipation, and his chosen method was the mass meeting. These would attract over 100,000 people, correctly assuming that the authorities would not dare interfere with this. He did, however, annoy the Protestant-controlled Dublin corporation sufficiently that one of their number, John d'Estaing, challenged him to a duel, which, as an experienced duelist, he was expected to win. However, in an unlikely upset, O'Connell killed him, and this so badly affected him that he later swore off dueling completely, resolving to accept impulse. I cannot help but feel that contemporary political discourse would be much improved if dueling made a comeback, as people would face physical consequences for their bullshit. In 1828, he stood for and was elected as an MP for County Clare, the first Catholic to be elected in 140 years. This forced the issue, as the penal law said he could not take his seat in Westminster, and the government of the Duke of Wellington, who had a long career after Wellington, eventually decided it would be less disruptive to scrap the remaining penal laws and let him in rather than keep them. So they did, and he became an MP, as later did all four of his sons. In 1841, he became the first Catholic to be Lord Mayor of Dublin for a century and a half, but that would be his last real political success. He had chosen to campaign for the repeal of the Act of Union, not necessarily on its own merits, but as a tool for further concessions, and this rather abstract concept did not always energise support as emancipation had. Nevertheless, he got 1 million people to a meeting at the Hill of Tara, and was planning an even bigger one at Clontarf, when the military finally intervened to stop it, and he meekly submitted. He was pretty committed to non-violence, not just from the duel with d'Estaing, also because he had been in Paris during the early years of the Revolution, and that gave him a complete horror of mob violence. His credibility, however, never really recovered from being arrested and submitting, and he was out of favour with younger and more radical nationalists who were anti-clerical rather than strongly Catholic, as O'Connell was, and his abstract concern for repeal was not what was needed when the very real and immediate concern of the potato famine was beginning just as he died. 50. Douglas Hyde, first President of Ireland, which is a nothing job. It usually is in Westminster-style governments that have become republics, because that system evolved under constitutional monarchy, and once you don't have a monarch anymore, you still need someone to be head of state, even if they don't normally do anything very much. For the same reason, no one cares very much about the presidents of India and Pakistan. I bet you didn't even know those places had presidents. Anyway, he was an academic, and spent most of his career devoted to the preservation of Irish language and culture. He was pulled from retirement in 1838 as an unopposed candidate to be Ireland's first president. Amongst his perceived qualifications to this were: 1. They wanted someone with gravitas and prestige, but in no danger of becoming a dictator. The former, because the 1937 Constitution still left it a bit vague if the President or the King of England was the head of state. The latter, well, because it was 1938 and dictatorship was in. 2. He was a Protestant, and they wanted to avoid giving the impression that Ireland was a Catholic confessional state. 3. He was widely respected and admired. So he became president until 1945, one of his last official duties being to visit the German ambassador to present official condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler. 100. Charles Stewart Parnell. Now, I know he shows up in the third version of Come Out Ye Black and Tans, a catchy Irish veritable song that I will not sing for you because I'm English and it will be about as appropriate as me covering NWA. Apart from that, got nada, so let's see, okay? From a wealthy Anglo-Irish Protestant family, because this was the point where nationalism wasn't almost exclusively Catholic, he got his political start in the Home Rule League, being elected as an MP in 1875, and after starting quietly became associated with the more radical wing of the League, and was one of those who exploited parliamentary procedure in order to be disruptive and force the body to pay more attention to Irish questions. This included tactics such as giving lengthy speeches which were largely irrelevant to the topic at hand. Now, most politicians do that, but that's often because they're pompous windbags in love with the sound of their own voice. Parnell weaponised it. Apart from Home Rule, i.e. the Irish governing themselves again, the big important Irish question that they wanted to draw attention to was the situation of Irish tenant farmers. You see, in 1870, half of Ireland was owned by just 750 families, and just 3% of farmers owned the land they farmed. Oh yeah, and most of those 750 families were absentee landlords living in England, and tenant farmers had very, very few rights. A lot of families had lost what little land they had during the Great Famine, and farm incomes were under pressure as Irish food exports were becoming uncompetitive. North America was beginning to export large amounts of cheap wheat, and technological developments like the steamship and refrigeration allowed meat to be imported from places like Argentina and New Zealand, all of which undercut Irish farm incomes and was not necessarily always associated with a reduction in rent. It took a lot of incremental legislation and a lot of political struggle to accomplish, including the invention of the boycott, and was accompanied by a fair bit of violence, but by 1929, 97% of farmers owned their own land. After a speaking and fundraising tour to North America, he returned to Ireland for the 1818 general election, being elected for 3 seats and opting to take up that for Cork. Matters were coming to a head with increased violence and evictions, and Parnell and several of his followers would be imprisoned in 1881 and the Land League suppressed. In May 1882, he negotiated from Kilmarnock Jail the unofficial Kilmarnock Treaty with Liberal Prime Minister Gladstone, where both parties agreed to end violence and coercion and work together for reform. 4 days after that, the Phoenix Park murders happened, where 2 senior British government figures were stabbed to death in Dublin by members of the militant Irish Republican Brotherhood splinter group, the Invincibles. On the one hand, Parnell had demonstrated that he could not prevent violence, but on the other, his condemnation of the act cemented his alliance with Gladstone, and the IRB flavoured into obscurity for the next couple of decades. He would then found the new Irish National League to replace the Land League and rename the Home Rule League the Irish Parliamentary Party. Following all this, strongly organising both, he would turn the IPP into the first modern disciplined political party at Westminster, as at the time both the Conservatives and the Liberals, who were the 2 main parties, were more loosely organised tendencies than anything else. Throughout the 1880s, the IPP would often hold the balance of power between the Conservatives and Liberals, but was never able to get a Home Bill passed. Then, in 1887, came a near disaster. The Times released letters showing that he had privately condoned the Phoenix Park murders of 5 years before. After a full inquiry that lasted a couple of years, these letters were revealed to be forgeries. He won substantial damages from the Times and returned to Parliament after his exoneration in triumph and apparently at the height of his power. Within 9 months, it would all come crashing down. Within 2 years, he would be dead. In November 1890, it was revealed in divorce hearings that Parnell had been the long-term lover of Catherine O'Shea, wife of William O'Shea, who had been the go-between for the Kilmarnock Treaty and fathered 3 of her children. This created a huge scandal on both sides of the Irish Sea. In Ireland, the Catholic-dominated IPP and INL and their clerical allies On the one hand, in Ireland, the Catholic-dominated IPP and INL and their clerical allies could not tolerate this behaviour in the leader. And in Britain, neither could the Victorian morality of his nonconformist liberal allies. Parnell refused to resign or back down, and his movement split. He tried to keep going, but he would die early at the age of 45, just a few months after finally marrying Catherine. Post-death, his reputation has recovered to the extent that he is the great lost leader, and the tragic and romantic circumstances involved only increase his legend. It is possible that without his affair with Catherine, he might have been able to deliver an independent and united Ireland and or avoid the bloodshed of the 20th century. That's some big ifs, though. Straight out of Anfar, very little bitch called Dushka, from the pack called Doggies with Gratitude. When I'm called back, I might come back, or maybe not if I don't feel like it. This book's too short, you've no biscuits? Well then you'll have to come get me.